Starting in verse 11 of 1 Peter chapter 2. It said, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers, abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul, and keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation." Peter starts this off with resident aliens and visiting foreigners or strangers. And primarily the people he was writing to live in what we now call Turkey. And Turkey was where the 7 churches of Asia are. And it was far away from Rome. It was on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. But what Rome did was they established an allegiance there. Every single one of the cities in the 7 cities of Asia had a temple and a place to worship Caesar, along with all the other Roman gods that were scattered throughout. And since Caesar very seldom came there, what Caesar did was oftentimes granted the cities Roman citizenship. So if you lived in Ephesus, you became a Roman citizen. And that had a lot of privileges on that. But along with the privileges, this is the way the government does. On one side, we give you a privilege, quote unquote, and on the other side, we take it out. And what they demanded was allegiance. And in any given city, like at Ephesus or Thessalonica, if you were a Christian and you refused to partake in these votive offerings unto Caesar, if you refused to partake in the normal society's stuff, you were ostracized and considered to be a bad citizen on that. And this was a fine balance that the Christians of the first century had to do. You all memorized Romans chapter 12, and it says that we are not to be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And as Jesus said, we can be in the world, but we cannot be of the world. And this is where you and I are still struggling today. It's not a matter of politics to me. It's a matter of allegiance to Jesus. And so when we talk about politics are how we solve our material problems here. But what you and I have is a greater agenda, and that is that we are resident aliens like Abraham when he left and he came into the land of Canaan. They used the same terminology here. He lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents, looking for a city in which the foundations and architect were God. So Abraham, as he wandered through the land of Canaan and down into Egypt and back up to Canaan, it was his land. God gave it to him. But they weren't really going to possess that for another 400 years. So he lived among these people, and he lived as an alien. And he, in fact, said so much, "I'm a resident alien and a visiting stranger." And again, using the same words that Peter picked up on. And so he recognized he was not a Canaanite. He was not part of their religion. He was not part of their people. He was not part of their society. But he didn't fight against it. He wasn't trying to change their society. He was just trying to live with God wherever he went. So Peter's readers, we need to reorient ourselves that, yes, I live here and it's perfectly fine to be an American. It's perfectly fine to think that this is the best country that I've ever lived in. And if you've never visited a foreign country, I would suggest you go and visit and look. In fact, I've told several people, feel free to move there. They don't really want to do that. But all of the problems we're facing, I just want you to remember this. As God's people, we face them differently. And this is not really a political problem. I'll vote for my conscience, but I'm not really worried about the political side. We can't get very many worse candidates put forward, and those are the two best that we have been offered, and you're going, I think something's wrong on that. And from a Christian standpoint, that's absolutely right, because they're not good. But I want you to think, as we get down a little bit further, we're going to talk about the emperor, the king, the one and ruler. And at the time that Peter wrote that, it was Nero, one of the most dastardly, ungodly reprobates that ever ruled Rome. And yet, Peter spoke respectfully of him and said that Christians were to submit. So we are different. Our allegiance is to God, first, foremost, and always. But I live here. And so I'm going to be a good neighbor. I'm going to, as much as I can, live a godly life. Now, that may mean I don't go to the temples. That may mean I don't worship Caesar. And that means I'm going to be slandered. And that's what Peter had just said. Spoken evil of, slandered. And that wears on you. I've watched young people. I've watched them since I was one. And it's been many, many, many years. And one of the hardest things is they like to fit in. I remember when my daughter started high school, and she had this blonde hair, and it was cut. And when I drove up one day to pick her up, I began noticing. And every one of the girls had the same hairdo. Y'all remember that from the 50s? And some of the hairdos were just dumb. But that was what's popular. And if you didn't have it that way, you didn't fit in. You stood out. The same thing with clothes. You had to wear what everybody... And so as a Christian, if you simply took your stand, I'm going to do what my conscience tells me is right with God, you're not going to fit in. And not fitting in means you got to go against the tide. And this was the bigger problem. It wasn't physical persecution. That came and went. There were oftentimes 20, 30 years where there was no persecution of the church as far as Roman arresting them and beheading them. But there was always the persecution from the social level. And so we have to align ourselves first with God and then as much as we can to society. He said, first of all, there are just some things that are wrong. Y'all know that? The works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, and he walks through that. My favorite on that list is the last one. Does anyone remember what it is? And such like. So it doesn't have to be listed if it's like those. And if you do those things, that is, this practicing of that, you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. You can't be a citizen of God's kingdom and live like the world lives. There has to be a change. You all know that. I appreciate and love you because I feel perfectly at home in our meetings and our congregation. I can come and visit and sit down, and I don't worry about your vocabulary. I don't worry about where you've been. That is such a blessing, and that's what the church was all about. And so on the other side, we are to, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, let your light shine, that the world may see your good works. And when they see your good works, they're going to glorify God. They may not like your religion. They may not like your theology, but they're going to recognize one thing. He's sure a nice guy. And that comes from being what Christ knows. Now, when this is usually presented in so many commentaries, it's presented as two separate units, totally opposed to each other. And I'm going to tell you what, there's never been a society that is really that much of a dichotomy. And so what you really see is there was the life that the Roman society lived, and they said this is acceptable. And then there was the life that Christians would live, and they said, well, this is what is acceptable. And there were some things that overlapped. For example, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the brother that was having an affair with his stepmom. And Paul went out of his way to say, and even the Gentiles think that is abhorrible. So there are things that even the world considers to be unacceptable. Scary proposition, those things are disappearing. But ours don't change. And we're going to continue to do the same thing. And if that means we stand out, we stand out. Because your purpose in all that you do is to glorify God. And never give the world a chance to point their finger and accuse us of wrongdoing and ungodliness. That's a big order. But that's where we're headed. Will you screw up? Yeah. Will you make mistakes? Yeah. Will you sometimes lose your temper and say things you shouldn't have said? Yeah. Will you sometimes be kind of snarky and... Yeah. But what we have is we have forgiveness available. And we can always come back and be forgiven. We need to come back, but we can be forgiven on that. And the real problem here was not persecution per se, but slander. In the first century, Christianity, does anybody have an idea of what the percentage of Christians were in the first century? What percentage of the Romans? Half of 1%, 1%, maybe 2%. It didn't get to be 10% until 100 to 150 years later. And didn't get to be more than that till 300, 400 years later. So imagine, if you will, if we lived in a completely ungodly, where there, not denominationalism, but I mean paganism on that. And here we are, and we would be about that number in San Angelo. 100,000 people, we got 50. Okay, that's about half of 1% on that. Can you imagine what it would be like? Everybody else disagrees with you. Everybody else thinks you're just flat weird. You just are different. And so the Roman writer Suetonius, he considered Christianity to be, his words, a mischievous superstition. And that was because they believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We're going to talk about that this morning in the sermon a little bit. What they believed and why they believed that. Tacitus, one of the Roman historians, described Christianity as a dangerous superstition and Christians as a race detested for their evil practices. What kind of evil practices? Well, they wouldn't worship gods. They were atheists. You and I laugh at that, but if everybody else is worshiping all these other gods, and you're the one that says, no, I'm not going to do that. Hello, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Are you really willing to take a stand like that? And the early Christians did on that. But there will be a day of visitation, and we don't know whether that means that someday they will get in trouble. And then they'll understand why you were doing these things. And if nothing else, it means on the day of judgment, when God comes, they will see as you are glorified for being one of God's people, and they are rejected. There will be this. Saints will be vindicated. In this life, do you remember the souls under the altar in the book of Revelation and what they ask? How long till what? Yeah. When are you going to judge those rascals? When are you going to condemn them, bring them to judgment? And God said, in my time, and He's going to. And we never know when that's going to be. And we don't really know who it's going to be that's doing that. When God used the Assyrians to punish the northern tribes, Assyria was worse morally than the 10 tribes, except for one factor. The 10 tribes knew better. God told them, and God revealed them, and God sent prophets to them. And the Assyrians were doing what they wanted to do. I was going to say the best they could, it's what they knew. Anyway, so then he turns to human authorities. And he says, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether as to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as freed men. Do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. And then summarize. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. And I'm going to tell you, I'm totally disgusted with social media. Because what has happened is there's no honor. There's no respect. There's no showing any type of respect for being a person, for having an idea. And so every single thing that you read, if you've never done this, you keep reading and you read the comments to whatever has been written. And it's all slander and evil speaking, name calling. But it doesn't deal with the issue. Argue issues, don't argue people. Fight against ideas, but don't slander people. And that's hard to do. And in this day and age, on the internet, you can get away with it because nobody knows who you are, and it can go viral on that. Civil authorities. Now, there were kings like Herod. Those were local rulers, but they were subject to the emperor. So when he's talking about king here, he's including all of those that are in these positions of authority. Remember what Jesus told Pilate? You would have no authority at all, except my Father allows it on that. Now, do not make a mistake, and I've seen this happen so oftentimes. People begin thinking that since the rulers are God's servants, that God handpicks our presidents. I challenge you, take a look at the list. God didn't pick the man. He said we need to have civil government. There need to be rules. There needs to be someone in charge, and rules need to be enforceable, so there is punishment on that. But we need to recognize every single ruler that has ever lived is purely human. And they have good points, and they have a lot of bad points. And total authority totally corrupts, and it's a problem that just goes. So they are created. But here's what you're asked to do. Submit. That's a dirty word today. In America, nobody wants to submit. We all want to be our own king and make up our own rules and do what I want to do. And yet, the first century, this was the rule. Submit. You mean I'm going to submit unto Nero? Yeah. I'm going to submit unto Herod? Yeah. You're not going to do ungodly things. And if the choice becomes between being godly and doing something that they request, then like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you say, not going to do it. Richard, what's the Hebrew names? Abednego. Okay. Well, that's not their Hebrew name. Anyway, submit. The church submits to the Lord. That's what we're told. Slaves are to submit unto their masters. Children are to be submissive to their parents. Wives are said to be submissive unto their husbands. Members are to be submissive to the leaders in the congregation. Young men are to be submissive unto the older men. Women are to be submissive unto the men in the assemblies and during the teaching of that. Now, here's one of the interesting things. It means the same in all of those. And we just have a trouble with that. Because we live in America where we have the right of independence. And each one of us is. And the truth of the matter is, no, there's all kinds of rules. If I made a rule, I would allow me to drive 95 or 100 down Sherman Way. How well is that going to work? And the answer is, it's not going to work. And so they stop you and they fine you and they punish you. And hopefully you will say, I don't want to pay that fine again. So you start driving. Well, we have to have these rules. There have to be stop signs. There has to be, which side of the street are you going to drive on? It's for society on that. Now, submission does not indicate your value or your worth. Not at all. For example, if you're a buck private, who do you submit to? Everybody above you. Okay. And so this is what takes place. Now, a buck private, as far as a person, may be a far better person than the general. May be more godly, may be smarter, may have more character. So, but in this chain of authority, there's still the submission on that. And I have said, and I'm still waiting for somebody to argue with me, and after 50 years of doing this, I'm still waiting. Submission implies some degree of disagreement. You put your hand on a hot stove, and about that time, somebody behind you yells, "Get your hand off that." What are you going to do? Now, you see, you were already moving your hand. It doesn't take me long to find out how hot a stove is, and you move your hand. Now, I'll tell you where submission would come if the guy behind you had put that back on. Will you submit? I don't know. I don't think I would. But submission implies this idea. In the first case, why did you take your hand off of the stove? You wanted to. It hurt. I'm not going to do that again. Okay. So there was no submission when he yelled, "Take your hand off." You were just doing what you wanted to do. But when he said, "Put your hand back on," now comes where the disagreement comes. And this happens with husbands and wives. This happens with children and parents. How many of you had your children disagree with you? You know, I used to tell my kids, sit down and talk to me. You have every right to disagree with me. And you may convince me. They knew they weren't going to do that. I basically knew that. But I gave them a hearing. I wanted them to talk. I wanted them to know you have a right to have your own opinions about this. But on the bottom line, there is a bottom line, and that's where this is. Now, when you submit, one of the best definitions came out of a Bible class I was teaching, and the fellow was talking about it, and he said, it means to lovingly follow their leadership. Now, I've seen wives that submitted, quote unquote, and then for the next year and a half, they made life miserable for their husbands. They never submitted. That was a passive-aggressive approach to getting their own way on that. And so we have to be very careful on that. In our submission, for example, slaves to master, that's to be done in reverence, done in respect, in honor to the master, even if he's a crumb, even if he's unjust on that. So, me, submit, well, I already used this, but in Acts 4, when they told the apostles, you can't preach Jesus anymore. And they simply looked at him and said, well, we're going to obey God on this one instead of you. Because Jesus said, go and preach the gospel unto every creature. Now, I can either do what God said, or you've told me I can't do what God said. But I've seen brethren use this for all manner of things. Everything they disagreed with that the government ever said. I will obey God. Well, God didn't tell me to drive 95 miles an hour. That's my desire and wish. The older I get, the faster I want to drive. So does that really work? The answer is no, it never will. So we must determine, before you go down that road, you must determine when it actually is a conflict, when it actually is making you go against what God has said. And you know, in all of my years of living here in America, I've not found where that happened. I found lots of things that I didn't agree with, found lots of things I didn't like, but I didn't find where they forced me to not do that. Now, I see things changing, and that may change in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And the government may make rules of speech or whatever that you simply said, I can't go there. But be careful before you run down that. It's not just what you don't like, but rather make sure what you're doing is godly. Because we want to have God shown in a good light here. The purpose of governments? Punish evildoers. Paul said that in Romans chapter 13. Peter said it here in Peter. And then the opposite side is to praise good and evil, to praise that which is good. But the problems there are legion, because did Nero know the difference between good and evil? I don't think so. I think he was such a warped personality that which was evil, he reveled in and did that. So, do unbelievers, now, I'm going to say, get on Facebook and read what they say. But if you get on Facebook, don't just read all of your little cliquey friends. For this experiment. Now, let me rephrase that. My advice is don't get on Facebook. Number 2, if you get on Facebook, be really selective about all the junk that's coming across that you're going to read. But what you begin seeing is you begin reading all of these other stuff that gets put out there, and it's ungodly to the core. They don't know the difference between right and wrong. And so they're highly inconsistent. Our leaders, the inconsistency and the hypocrisy among them, you get totally disgusted with that. But remember, I'm God's person. I'm God's citizen. I am going to be me. I don't care who the president is. I don't care who Congress is. I don't care who our mayor is. I'm going to be me, and I'm going to live a godly life and glorify God in doing that. And then, okay, they're supposed to punish evildoers. What's the punishment supposed to be for hitting somebody else? And you got to decide whether it's premeditated. You got to decide whether it was dangerous enough to take the person's life or just slightly aggressive and an annoyance. And all of that's where the governments come in. They make all of those rules and fine-tune all of that stuff. And I'm going to tell you, if you ever start reading our law book, you're going to disagree with a lot of them, particularly the punishment phrase. But that's not our concern. That's the government's responsibility. And God will hold them accountable for that. Why? Again, it's for the reputation of God's people, and thus for God's glory. We want to always do what we understand to be right. We are said to be slaves of God. And that word slave meant slave. That was the Roman word that meant you were owned by whoever the master was supposed to be. But God owns us. He's my master. He's my owner. He's the one that I have to give the accountability to. And so I'm going to live in whatever country I live. Do you all realize how hard this is in China? Do you realize how even harder it is in Iran to live as a godly person and have that? Could you do it? How many of you would have joined the rebellion when we rebelled against England? I'm with Bill on this. I think I would have. Would it have been right? Well, I don't know. Does the government have a right to tax? And the answer is yeah. Can they tax more than you want to pay? They've done that all my life. Now, I don't have answers to this, but I'm going to tell you that's where the problem comes. Would you have joined the rebellion of the Civil War, joining the South to fight against the North? And the answer is, I don't know. I'm from Iowa. Probably not. Then I grew up in Southern California, so I'm a Southerner. Southern California is not Georgia, I can tell you that. Now, what we have then is we live as free men, free to do what God wants us to do. Consequences come, but I'm going to be godly in this life. So, honor all men. Show respect for people. They are God's creation on that. Argue vehemently against ideas, but respect the person. And that's difficult. Love the brotherhood. And brotherhood here is not a brotherhood of churches. It's a brotherhood of people. And I can give you names of 100 Chinese brethren. And they live under a totally different situation. It's hard. And yet, in some regards, it's a lot easier. But honor all men, love the brethren, fear God. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then he specifically says, honor the king. Going back to the Revolutionary War. King George, go back and read what we said about him. And how we... And I don't know how well I would have done as following Peter's book during those times. Now, fear, that's from the word phobia. We get phobia. And so when he says fear, that word can mean simply fear. Knees knocking, quaking on that. But in verse 18, the same word is used and it means respect. And what you have is you have this degrees. And what changes everything between fear and respect and awe is love. And that's why John wrote in 1 John, there's no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. So here's the question that you have to keep looking. Where are you on this little sliding scale? Now, if you're doing evil, you better fear. That's right. But on the other side is, we're serving God out of love. Does God use fear as a motivator? Absolutely. Jesus said more about hell than any other person in all of the Bible. Why? He knew what it was. And he knew that nobody wants to go there if they understand what it is. And so he warned and he warned. And that was the motivation of fear. But on the other side is, we love because he first loved us. And so I'm trying to move. I want it to be over here on this spectrum that everything I do is out of love for God. And I'm not worried about over here. Is there still punishment available? Could be. But if you're over here and everything you're doing, what's the first commandment? Love God. How? All your heart, mind, soul, and strength. When I love God that way, there's no room for fear. I love him and he loves me and we are going to do, okay. So that's it. Now, servants and masters. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those that are good and gentle, but those that are unreasonable. For this finds favor with God, if for the sake of your conscience towards God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. What credit is there if when you sin and you're harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure, this finds favor with God. If you do things that are bad, you deserve to be punished. You won't get a lot of sympathy from me. You did it. Okay. And there's no accolades in you. You held up really well being punished for the evil that you did. So, I hope you learn not to do that again. But when you have not done that which is wrong, and now, how many of you have ever been punished for something you didn't do? You know how many times I told my mother that? Wasn't true. But there have been times. Some of the speeding tickets I got when I was 19, they weren't true. But you have a 19-year-old and you have a police officer, and you stand between the judge, and it's your word against his. And guess what? So you just learn to shake your head and go ahead and go with it. Hopefully you learn to slow down. But this is the point that he is making on that. Servants and masters, first of all, it's an interesting thing. This is not the word slave that we saw earlier. This is the word house servant. And if you were a house servant in Rome, you were one lucky dude, because that was easy. Now, if you were a slave, you may be out in the salt mines. You may be out in the gladiatorial events. Average lifespan about 6 weeks. But we are, if we were in a privileged position, you get uppity. You begin thinking, I'm privileged. And what Peter wants you to see is if you are lucky enough to be one of these house servants, then you still have to act correctly. And that means that though you're slaves of God, you submit. Who's the master in this? What if he wants you to do something that you think is just totally unnecessary? It's his house. It's his money. It's his. So graciously defer your judgment. You can disagree, be respectful, but in the end, you do that. And you do that not only to the gentle and good ones, that's a lot easier, but what if you had a real slob of a master that really did treat you badly? Would you still serve him with respect? Would you still submit? I'm glad I don't have to do that. That would have just been hard. So even unto the unreasonable and the perverse, the crooked, the unjust on that. It can result in suffering. Okay. But make sure that it's unjust suffering. You're not being suffered because you did wrong. You are unjustly accused and punished in that. And then you bear up. And with God, that is endearing. And God sees and God knows on that. So never do anything that we should think is wrong. I talked about the conscience a couple weeks ago. And the conscience simply is what you've trained yourself to know right and wrong. And if you think something is wrong, don't do it. Now, you may learn better later on. In fact, you may think something is perfectly all right, and you're going to learn better later on that that's not supposed to be done. But don't go against your conscience. Educate it. Challenge it with facts. But as long as that's your position of right and wrong, don't violate it. That is absolute. Then, who can do that? And so the end of the chapter is the example of Jesus. You've been called for this purpose since Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps of suffering, who committed no sin. There was no deceit found in his mouth. And when he was being reviled, he didn't revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but he kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. Now you were continually straying like sheep, but now you've returned unto the shepherd and the guardian of your soul. We were called for this purpose. That I am a Christian. What does that mean? That's one of those compound words, and it means a follower of Christ. Following his teaching, following his example on that. First of all, he set a high bar. He didn't sin. Well, I strive for that, but I mess up. No deceit. Don't ask if you don't want to know the truth, because you're going to get told the truth. No, I don't always. Well, no revenge. Boy, that's hard. It's not hard when you're 5'4" and the guy that did whatever he did is 6'5". But you know, if it's some 9-year-old that's only 4 foot tall, revenge, well, it's not ours. Avenge not yourself. Leave space for God to take care of that. And that's hard to do on that. But this is our complete trust in God. How many of you think God will even the scales up? The answer is absolutely. Now, I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know exactly who it is that's going to get what, but I trust this: God will do what's right. He will always do what's right. He knows their thoughts, He knows their abilities, He knows their opportunities, and He will take all of that into account and do it. And when He finishes, it will be right. Now here's my hope. Because of Jesus, God will say, no punishment for you. That's grace. That's mercy. I count on the death of Jesus to be my sacrifice. So I'm going to put up with this world. I told Sharon the other day, I said, you know, the good news is 74 years old. That means I don't have to put up that much longer. And if it keeps getting worse and worse, the older I get, the shorter that time's going to be. But what if you're 14? Our young people face a whole different world that's facing them. But you know, if they become Christians, they have to follow the same rules. They need to learn this. That's chapter 2. We're going to jump into chapter 3 next week. We're going to talk about wives and husbands and masters and slaves. And living as a Christian is just not always easy to do. But here's the rules. Here's the guidelines. Thank you.